even your generation,
It's heartbreaking.
even your generation, very, very concerned about, well, our kids are all gone. And some of the kids now, the one person that I know who's got a daughter who won't go because she knows that if she goes, there's going to be no one to look after parents when they get old.
Yeah.
So she's sort of held hostage.
Yeah.
Because the father's English.
It's actually heartbreaking.
Bizarre. Yeah.
It really is heartbreaking. And when you consider, I mean, you know, I speak, and I know my parents felt, my mum feels the same way. My dad, when he was still with us, felt the same way. The South African Jewish community in Pretoria, especially in Pretoria for us when we were there, was the warmest community.
Yeah. Yeah.
And South African Jews in general are very warm people.
Yeah.
Far warmer than, like, for example, the London community.
Oh, absolutely. It's also a very interesting community. You know, it was always very Zionist focused.
Absolutely. Very hardcore.
The youth movements were very powerful.
Yeah.
And the community wasn't like it is now. I've got to be careful here, where it's become very religiously focused in a, not an extreme sense, but a very, very United Synagogue kind of way. That if you don't belong kind of thing, or you're not Shomer Shabbat and you're not extremely kosher and so on, you have a problem.
Yeah.
And that's difficult anyway.
Yeah.
So should we talk about tonight just for a second? Yeah. Do we have any idea how many people we're expecting? Are the same people from last time?
The same people, you know, the list is very similar.
Because my link from last time didn't work, you know that. The link that worked was the one that you sent me. Because I went back and it said this link is good for both.
Mm.
So I hope that it
we've
works.
Got people, I mean, look, we've got 6 people in. That's
that's early. Yeah.
So people are joining.
Good. Okay.
There's
not a lot you can do about it anyway now. So, you know, it just might have been mine that was because I'd fiddled around with it.
Right.
I couldn't get on the first time, and we had to fiddle around, and
we
had to send another link.
Right.
But actually, you know, I'm not concerned about numbers, quite honestly. If there are 20 people there or there are 100 people there, it's you know.
Yeah.
But
and you've got your other one tomorrow night, have you?
Yeah, tomorrow night, and then there's a few other things we're doing. We've got a thing with the Union of Jewish Students.
Okay.
With a pilot with them that went very, very well. And we actually
what are you doing with them?
Well, we've got this link between the video clips. I don't know if you've seen any of them.
Well, I've seen a couple of them with the ones that are done through JTV with you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So there's 7 of them now that are up there.
Okay.
Right. It's almost like a Spotify list, you know, which is called the.
Is it is it a series?
Yeah, but it's not necessarily linked. Basically, the series is called Myth Busting the Israel-Palestine Conflict. So the first 2 are about the myths. So then there's Israel's Wars of Survival. We start with 48 and then 67. I don't do 56 because 56 wasn't a war of survival, quite honestly. So it's 48, 67, 73, and the Lebanese wars, the next one they're going up, the 2 Lebanese wars, and then the Gaza war. And then the next theme is going to be the impact of the Aliyot on Israeli society. So starting with the Chalutzim and then the Sfaradim, the Jews from Arab countries, and so and
then do you go through into the Russians and
right the way through to the Ethiopians.
Yeah.
It's a lovely series. But that links nicely with this whole idea. We're sort of creating an organization now. We actually thought of a name which might just work. I'm run it by you. It's called YJI. Now it could be the letter Y, JI, or WHYJI. Why Jewish identity?
Right.
Which rings really nicely. I think
it's
beautifully, right?
Yeah.
So the idea is that kids going to universities now, it's basically walking into this fresher week, this apartheid week, without any tools to stand up to things like the BDS movement, to this Bristol vitriol, and it's really vitriolic. These guys coming down from Bradford with their Free Palestine flags, you know, or the Black Lives Matter movement
all this
taking over, or, you know, bringing in and adopting the Free Palestine movement.
Shocking.
So these kids, so what we do is an interactive, a Zoom kind of session like we're doing now, but instead of being an Israel update, it's on how Israel affects anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism in Israel, because that's where this vitriol is coming from. Because basically, and what I do is I do a very quick, I'll just give it to you very quick, a very quick equation. Jew equals Israel, which is a Jewish homeland. So whether you like it or not, Israel's Jew. Jew equals Israel. Israel equals racist. Therefore, Jew equals racist. So I, as Jeremy Corbyn, I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm anti-racist. I've been anti-racist all my life. So what do you want? Why are you calling me an anti-Semite? And that, you know, that argument, you have to have the tools to stand up to it. Otherwise, you know, you're gone. So that's basically how it fits in with the pilot went
very interesting. It's very interesting. I might look to meet with you and some colleagues at the WZO in the not too distant future to talk.
You know, again, what we're trying to do is just cover costs. We're not making money. It's a really altruistic kind of thing. Myself and Doreen Brown, she's her husband passed
here with us tonight. I can see her name. Yeah.
She shouldn't be.
Also,
somewhere else.
Right, just to let you know, we've also got we've got the new head of the WZO here in the UK. He's is a lovely chap. He's a brigadier general from the IDF.
Oh, really? What's his name?
Noam Reef, R-E-E-F.
I know who he is.
Really? Right, very skinny guy.
Yep.
A lovely chap.
But he must be in his late 40s, early 50s. How old is he?
Yeah, I would have said early 40s, but I mean, look, that's me. I don't know.
I know of him.
I'm not the most perceptive of people.
You don't know who I am, but I know who he is. Yeah. Right. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So is he? But he's Israeli.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm saying he speaks with That's good. I was going to say, because the guy I know is not an Anglo-Saxon or American. Or
no. He's literally just come here before the holidays from Israel.
Is he a Chovesh Kippah? Because I remember a guy who wasn't a Chovesh Kippah.
Do you know what? I met him. I saw him again this morning, and I can't recall if.
Okay, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I can't recall.
But it would be interesting because he's got a job on his hands.
Yeah, for sure.
Really, I mean, you guys.
We were talking about doing a program in schools for just about Israel, staying away from the. No, this is for the age group of year 10, not year 10, year 8s.
Okay.
So softening them into the whole idea.
Right, so let me give you a word of warning, right? We tried to get into the schools. Just, again, to give some knowledge. The schools are controlled by the rabbis.
Yeah.
Unless you're going in with some kind of religious slant to your Zionism, you won't get in the door. Unfortunately.
Was it because your program was overtly about politics?
No, it wasn't. It's not about politics. It's about anti-Semitism. Ours was primarily focused around Israel's impact. It was before the Gaza war, right? Which the surge in anti-Semitism over there, we can talk about another time. But I'm happy to meet with you guys and show you the program that we are doing with the students, which can be, again, taken down different level. But the good thing about it, the Zoom gives you the tool to take it out of the physical context of the school building itself. Yeah. And that's critical. That's absolutely brilliant in that level. Anyway. Yeah. How many have we got? We got a couple of minutes.
Okay, we've got about 30.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, I mean,
I'd like to start on time, but I mean, it's up to you. You can call.
So we sent out an email. We sent out an email Friday and again earlier today to everyone, excluding yourself and me, and the WZO people, just reminding them about. Okay, now we've got 33 people. Okay. Just reminding them about tonight, but I'm going to admit them all in because I've said at 7:02 we'll let them in. Okay. So I'm going to admit everyone in, and I'll do my little spiel and then hand over to you.
Good. Okay. Yep, we're good to go.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Just going to give it another minute or so whilst we wait for everyone else to come in and join us. Please do feel free to turn on your videos so that you can all see each other and get the feeling, a bit more of a sort of meeting feeling, see your friends if you have any friends in here. But all we would ask is that you please keep your mics turned off. So please keep your mics muted. And that's just out of respect for our speaker this evening, so that all the auditory focus can be on our speaker, and that we won't have anyone's background noises interrupting the flow of the evening. Welcome back, everyone. For those of you who joined us for part one of this series, thank you for coming to part two. Shana Tova to everyone who celebrates, and please God, it will be a better year for all of us, a healthy, peaceful, prosperous, and COVID-free year, please God, and with travel being easier for all of us. So welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us on behalf of the World Zionist Organization in the UK and the Zionist Federation. Thank you again for joining us this evening. As you know, our guest speaker this evening for part two of this event, All You Need to Know About Israel's Knesset, is Ian Lucas. And I think with that, I shall hand over to Ian, as I don't want to bore you any longer. But if you could just please keep your mics muted. And any questions can be submitted through the chat section, and we will do our very best to answer as many of them as possible. So thank you again, everyone, and I'll hand over to Ian. Thank you. Over to you, Ian.
Hi, thanks, Steve. Erev Tov, good evening. Hi, everyone. Shana Tova. I'm going to share my screen immediately and get straight into, you need to let me share my screen.
Ian, I think you should be able to share your screen now.
Yep, now I've got it. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Okay, bear with me 1 second while I just bring up my glasses. Without glasses, I can't hit the wrong button. You're gone. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my screen. We're on the session 2 of the Knesset, 24th Knesset, the 36th government, and the issues and the crises that we are facing. Now, this is what the agenda looked like when we started 10 days ago. We got as far as the National Unity Government, went through it, looked at its makeup. And I just want to remind people, so we are all really on the same page. Remember, the government is made up of 8 parties out of 13 that crossed the threshold. I reminded people of what the threshold was, how it happened, how the election worked, how we got to the 23rd, the 13th of the parties of the 20 so parties that stood in the election, and the government was sworn in just, we looked at that, and now this is what the government is made up of. Okay, 11 of the 13 parties are made up of the following. Just bear with me while I get this Alexa to get out of my, Alexa, stop. Unbelievable, doesn't matter where you are. A frightening concept. I'll try not to mention the name again. But there's our makeup of the parties. Again, 17 in the biggest party, right the way down to Ra'am, the Islamic party that's propping up the government. We're going to talk about that in greater detail. And remember, the Prime Minister's party has 7 seats in the Knesset. I'll stop there for a silence while it sinks in. Here's your government. Not a small number of people. And if you recall, we spoke about the number of accusations made by a number of these parties who were then in opposition of the size of Netanyahu's government and 34 ministers. There's no shortage of ministers here. Again, the sentence I mentioned over and over again last time was, we need a change at any cost. Those three words are paramount in the makeup of where we are, at any cost, and you'll see why as we go along. Okay, so what I'm going to try and cover this evening is the following. The government and the COVID crisis, the August-September crises, which never end. I mean, I could have gone August by day, I could have gone today by hour, and still wouldn't have got to where we need to be. Look at the government, the Knesset, and the connections with the USA, the southern border, the northern border, and if we got time, just to touch on where Israel sits as far as Afghanistan is concerned. Now, these are all things that have happened in the last 3 months that this government has come to power. Right? This isn't something that's been hung over 12 years or 5 years or 3 years. And you'll see the crises that not only the government has to face, but the country as a whole has to face, that the word that's used over and over again is haslama in Hebrew, deterioration. Something starts as a minor little incident, and within days, it's turned into a major incident. You can even go back within hours, it's turned into a major incident and deteriorates almost to war. And then it's pulled back, and then you start the next crisis. So we need to look at these things and how the government has handled this with really, really important view of how it's being dealt with. So let's start with the COVID crisis. Now, last year, Israel was the world leader in dealing with COVID. In all the waves, wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, everybody looked to Israel to see what Israel was doing. And suddenly, Israel dropped the ball. In fact, the czar, Israel has a COVID czar, right? And his terminology was, we've dropped the ball. And suddenly, the fourth wave arrives. Now, what's happened in the fourth wave? It's always one of these wonderful things of the perfect storm, right? Where a few things happen together. A new Za'am, the Delta, right? The Delta Za'am arrives. Variant in English. At the same time, Israel has a crisis of close to 1 million people in the Arab and Haridi communities that are refusing to be vaccinated. For all kinds of reasons. I don't want to go into the reasons. There are lots of reasons, of some just not motivated, some seeing it as an ideological issue, some seeing it as a religious issue, but a major, major issue. So they're close to 1 million people that are not jabbed. The second thing is, the schools are about to go, or the kids are about to go back to school. Schools are about to reopen. And everybody knows that worldwide, the biggest spreader of COVID is through the education systems, both here, wherever you look. And nobody knows how to deal with it, by the way. In fact, this evening on the Israeli news, there's a new study that's come out that's shown that kids have much more bad effect of long-term COVID than adults. And that's put the red flags up all over the place, because the approach has been kids under 12 are not going to be jabbed, because if they get COVID, doesn't matter. Even though they're spreading it through the schools, it doesn't matter. They don't get really sick. They don't get sick, but the long-term effects could be worse than adults. And no one knows again, because remember that as far as the third booster jab is concerned, Israel again is leading the world. And it's leading the world because Israel's been called the laboratory of Pfizer. Pfizer's laboratory, I'm going to come on to that in a minute, right? But everybody now is looking at what this third jab is about, including us here in the UK. And again, nobody knows. One thing everybody is sure of, that those people who've been vaccinated are safer and are not ending up in hospital taking up beds by those who aren't vaccinated. That's the only thing that people are sure of. That's been shown in every study, and primarily what's coming out of Israel. 70% and more of the people that are getting COVID are those who aren't vaccinated. Now, what happens with a perfect storm? At the same time that this is all happening, Ben Gurion Airport in Abag is in chaos because people are flooding in openly through the airport. At the same time, what's about to happen is what I call the Haridi Hajj to Uman in the Ukraine, where the Haridi supporters of the late Rabbi Nachman of Breslov is born. It's actually a Hajj. They go there Rosh Hashanah in thousands, similar to the Mount Meron kind of expression of the heritage. And they go to Uman, and they've come back in thousands, mostly unvaccinated. Some of them with forged vaccination certificates, by the way, which has also become an issue because nobody knows which are and which aren't. But the issue here is that it's almost impossible in a country so small, both physically and demographically, to keep control over how the spread is taking place. Now, the schools, as I said, kids have gone back to school. Not only have they gone back to school, but before they went back to school, nobody was quite sure how many teachers and gananot, nursery school teachers, kindergarten teachers hadn't been vaccinated. Now, if I'm a parent and I'm about to send my kids to school, and I discover that 3 or 4 teachers in the school my kids are going to haven't been vaccinated, am I going to send my kids to school or not? I doubt it. So they're close to 126,000 kids that aren't in school at the moment, not only because the parents aren't sending them there, but because there's been a policy taken on board by the government that in a class, if more than 70% of the kids test positive, the class is closed and all the kids are sent home, which has a massive impact on the economy and the society in general. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the government has had to take on board a huge, huge crisis. It hasn't ended. If anyone thinks that this pandemic is over, or Israel's won, or the UK has got the right policy by having all our stadia open and having 70,000 Manchester United supporters like me, I didn't go, but I wouldn't have gone if I had gone to see Ronaldo come back and wave my shirt around, and no one's going to get infected by all this. We're dreaming. So being the laboratory of Pfizer, as it's been called, this was the CEO of Pfizer who called it, by the way, so one of these leaked calls. Was a leaked email, I think. Another brilliant thing we have all over the place. Leaked emails and leaked, there are 2 quick stories about leaked things. 3 or 4 days ago, I think it was 2 days ago, in fact, there was a big cabinet meeting. It was a big cabinet meeting with 32 cabinet ministers, right? It's a big, all around the big table. The Minister of Health, Horowitz, is talking to one of the other ministers. I think it was the Minister it wasn't Minister of Education, one of the others, and by accident they left the microphone on. So he's talking to her, and they're talking to her, and he says something to the effect of, well, if they hadn't been vaccinated, the hospital bills wouldn't be full, and it's because they haven't been, this kind of thing, which should not have been heard. And there are a couple of other incidents I'm going to talk about of leaked and emails and calls that have had major impact on society. So that, for example, is the start that this government had to face. Now, if you remember last week, 2 days after our first presentation, my first presentation, the first reading of the budget was due to take place. And if you recall, I said, this is the crunch of where this government has to get through. If the budget doesn't pass, the government falls. Remember, this is the one bill that acts as a no confidence bill in Israel. Any other bill that doesn't go through doesn't matter. It's embarrassing. It's not the end of the world. But if the budget doesn't go through, there has to be an election. The government falls and the country goes to an election. And that's what happened. That's what's happened over the last 2 years, by the way. So the first reading of the budget, everything goes through, big sigh of relief all over the country. Everybody says, Todah Le'el, thank God, everything's fine now. Everything's going to be fine. 4 days ago, there's a jailbreak. In the jail, strangely enough, near the kibbutz where I lived, and I know that area really, really well. In fact, where these guys were spotted the first time was just by a petrol station, a gasoline station, across the road from the road that led up to the school where I taught all the years I was there. So the jailbreak in most places would be, okay, it's a jailbreak, except the 6 guys who escape are very high-profile terrorists with blood on their hands. 4 of them have got life sentences plus 30 years, that kind of thing. Now, this jailbreak has been called the Mechdal, the disaster of what the 73 war, because we're coming up to Yom Kippur, what the 73 war was to Tzahal, this is to the Shabbos, the Sheirut of the Beit Soar, the prison services. It is the most unbelievable stories. People can follow them, people know it. I'm not going to go into it. The main thing is that the impact that this had went right the way through the country, through the West Bank, through Gaza, right the way through. And I'm going to go into it in a little bit of detail because it's absolutely essential. And it's having an effect tonight, by the way, because rockets are flying out of Gaza tonight and last night. And the government, again, is having to deal with something. This word haslama comes up again, it's deterioration. What suddenly was a minor jailbreak with spoon, by the way. So the big thing, the protests in the West Bank were protests, everyone's holding a spoon, because that's how these guys got out. They dug spoons. With spoons, they dug a tunnel into the area where it was built on stilts so they could crawl through. And they found tonight, by the way, I must also, just a quick side story, the sand that they dug up through the spoons, they had to get rid of. It's almost like something out of, The Great Escape. They put the sand into the sewage pipes. And in the last 3 or 4 months, there have been blockages in the sewage system in the jail that they called outside plumbers in to come and clear. But no one thought of asking, and I could use some crude words here if I weren't in an esteemed audience, how did these pipes get blocked? Where did it come from? Where's the sand from? Anyway, we're not going to go into that. So everyone goes berserk. Within 2 or 3 days, they capture 4 of them. And the PR message goes out from the government, from the Minister of Interior Affairs, saying there was thanks to the Israeli Arabs that they caught these guys. Now, this had a major impact right the way through both the communities of Arabs that are called Israeli Arabs or Palestinian Israelis, which is a concept I've never ever understood, or by the Arabs in the West Bank, in the occupied territories, or the refugees as the 1948 Arabs, as an attempt by the Israeli government to split the Palestinian community down the middle. In other words, we want those outside of Israel or not Israeli citizens to regard the ones who are Israeli citizens as traitors. To add a problematic, another issue onto that is that Jenin, which is the nearest occupied city of the occupied West Bank, if you want to call it that, across the Green Line, is very near where this jail was. And the big fear was that the 6 of them would get to Jenin, which has got a large number of weapons in the refugee camp. I'm going to get to that in a minute. What Israel did as soon as the jailbreak was discovered, which took an hour and a half, by the way, you've read that kind of story, is another part of the fushla that went on, poured in thousands of troops and literally sealed the whole area off. And eventually, when they caught the guy, they reckon that 2 of them might have got to the Jenin refugee camp. Now, the Jenin refugee camp is a very problematic area for Israel. There's tension within it between Islamic Jihad and Fatah and Hamas. I don't want to go into the internal Palestinian politics, but that's become problematic now as well. But part of the deterioration, part of the Haslamah now, has become that Israel's trying to split the Palestinian community. Israel wants this whole issue to blow up so it can go into Gaza and use this as an excuse to send troops into Gaza, and there's talk of that. But more than that, in order to show support for the jailbreakers, for the terrorists that had escaped, Islamic Jihad fired rockets from Gaza on Friday and Saturday and Sunday and Monday. Now, the third part of the perfect storm is Prime Minister Bennett is due to meet, I've spoken about Jenin as we go on, is due to meet the President of Egypt today, Sisi. And this is all part of trying to calm down what's happening in Gaza, which became problematic when the money that was coming from Qatar in suitcases in cash was changed into being credit card stuff. Also another whole palaver of how the money that's keeping people in Gaza literally with food is getting into Gaza. So Bennett meeting with Sisi was absolutely critical that this didn't turn out to be some kind of, we have to call it over. And it's been a very successful meeting, which is another problem as far as the Palestinians are concerned, because the Egyptians and the Israelis working together is not what Hamas and Islamic Jihad want to see. So the government now is facing this real, what I call a perfect storm of incidents that within a day deteriorate into major crises. And that's how people have to view this. This isn't something that just happens. There's something that has an effect and a counter effect that the government has to deal with almost hourly. So there's this huge sigh of relief. Everything's going to be okay. And then there's another sigh that goes on, because now we have to look back at some of the crises that happened before, and I'm going to come back to them now, because as you know, I run this Israel update thing that, by the way, the first one starts tomorrow. I'm going to give a plug for it for the end of this. But there's this, I'm not doing an Israel update thing. I'm trying to bring in the crises that a new government is having to face. So if we look back a bit, the first thing that Israel as the new government has to face is its relationship with the US. Now, remember, at the same time that a new government, a new prime minister has come into power in Israel. And remember, I said last time, this is the first time that an American president is not meeting an Israeli prime minister called Benjamin Netanyahu. 4 presidents met with Netanyahu, who was one prime minister for 12 years. Suddenly, there's a new prime minister called Naftali Bennett, who goes to the White House to meet a new president called Joe Biden. Now, no one was quite sure of what was going to happen when they met. Then you had this crisis in the States, and this meeting almost got called off. The meeting took place, and everyone's hunky-dory. People weren't quite sure, and of course, Biden was exhausted. He hadn't slept for 2 days, gone through all these crises that the Americans were facing, storms on one side, hurricanes on one side, fires on the other side, people refusing to get vaccinated in the middle, and the overturning, or well, it was overturned, the abortion law in Texas. These are major issues. So the first thing that Biden and Bennett have to understand is the chemistry between them. Now, let's not underestimate for 1 minute what personal chemistry does in political leadership. It is a phenomenal, it's a phenomenon that us mere mortals will never understand. And we could go into the history of that and why and what and how. I'm not going to do that now. But they get on famously. And a meeting that was supposed to be 20 minutes, you know, this closed meeting, the private meeting is supposed to be 20 minutes, goes on for an hour, 55 minutes, and everyone is lovey-dovey, everything's fine. But the first thing Israel needs to make sure of is that the USA is going to replenish all the stocks of the Iron Dome, because the Iron Dome stocks were at their minimum after the last Gaza war. And I call it a Gaza war. If anyone says not a Gaza war, it was a Gaza war. So the importance here is once again the Israeli government is reinforcing the absolute law, if you like. Nothing, I wouldn't even call it less than that. That came out, if people see the videos, that the part of the video project I did of the 67 war, Israel, when Utant of the UN pulled out the UN troops just before the 6-day war, there was never, ever any doubt in anyone's mind that Israel would never, ever be dependent on foreign troops defending Israel, ever. Never going to happen. What Israel does have to have is the tools to defend itself, like the Iron Dome. So this was a major, major accomplishment, although it was, you know, almost a natural kind of development. But it's a very, very important part of how Israel and the government and the Knesset, by the way, works. You have a new president of Israel, by the way, Herzog, who is an accomplished politician, as was Rivlin. You know, these guys aren't figureheads. So the commitment again of the USA to ensure that Israel has the tools to defend itself is a major, major accomplishment. And I can't emphasize it enough. The next thing Israel has to deal with is its southern border. Now, the southern border, and I don't want to go into an update, and this isn't the Israel update, of course, come tomorrow night if you want to know what's really going on. But what's happening in the southern border is problematic in the sense that you've got a government now that's made up of literally two extremes. And whether the government likes it or not, to say we will not talk ideology or our manifestos and what we've promised and what we've done are irrelevant at this stage. What we're doing at the moment is make sure this country functions as a country and functions, and that's exactly what the sigh of relief was, right before all this, you know, perfect storm came about, is that how we deal with the southern border, how we deal with Gaza is very high up on the priority list. And it wasn't by accident, by the way, that Yair Lapid made a huge speech a couple of days ago on the approach that has to be taken in dealing with Gaza. And the emphasis is all on humanitarian stuff. You know, the Gazans do this, we'll do that, that kind of give and take, including the return of the bodies of the soldiers and the civilians that are held as hostage in Gaza. But the infrastructure in Gaza being controlled by Hamas is not simple, because when Israel sends in its planes, and you see it flattening buildings because Hamas, it was a headquarters of Hamas, or the Islamic Jihad had missiles in the basement, it's not as simple as that. Because whether we like it or not, the government is faced with a crisis that Hamas succeeded in turning itself into the protectors of Al-Aqsa. I discussed it last time, and I can't emphasize it enough. That this isn't about us and the Palestinians, us as in Hamas and the Palestinians. This is about us protecting the second holiest site in Islam, in Islamic religious belief. So it's a very, very important part of how the dynamics work. The second thing is this money from Qatar. And again, I can't underestimate this. This money in cash coming in suitcases once a month, $15 million. I mean, can you know, just the mindset is unbelievable. A guy walks through the check post with suitcases with $15 million of cash, half of which goes to Hamas, and they, you know, siphon off the top and goes building tunnels or whatever it might be. So Israel changes, the government changes its approach to how this money is going to go into Gaza, and it's going to be run by a UN bank, and everyone's going to have a credit card. Total disaster, didn't work. So now they're trying to work out some kind of way that there'll be a bank where people will go in, get the money so they can, remember, this is money that's keeping people alive, literally. The unemployment in Gaza amongst people under the age of 24 is close to 70%. There's no work, and you know, it's literally being kept on a food level. So the money from Qatar is very, very important. And on the Israeli side, the swap of prisoners and the bodies that are being held there is no less crucial, because people are saying, and Naftali Bennett was one of the most vocal in this. There's another one of the problems that the government's facing is Naftali Bennett's previous statements when he was where he was, and Ayelet Shaket's previous statements where she was, saying without getting the bodies of our soldiers back, or without getting the people that you're holding hostage, how can you give them money? Stop the money. Within a week, we'll have the bodies and the civilians back. Doesn't work like that. Because what people have forgotten is that Hamas is a terrorist organization that has little compassion for the civilians living in Gaza. And I'll stand by that statement. And I'll let that sink in a little bit as well. I'm happy to stand by that statement. Until Hamas starts worrying about its civilians, Israel has a problem. Now, the other big success that Hamas had was undermining the dukiyum, the coexistence in what they call the mixed cities. I don't want to go into that because that, again, is a story on its own. But the government has had to deal with this. And again, it's no less important than the infrastructure in the Arab communities. Now, I've got to be very careful. I want to just reiterate what I said last week about the statement that someone had mentioned that Arabs don't pay taxes. And I went and checked my statement that I made, which are 100% correct. I checked with the tax people. Every Israeli citizen by law has to pay tax. Whether they pay it or not is another personal story. But by law, every Israeli citizen has to pay an individual personal tax. There is also a local community tax called Arnona, similar to our community tax here. And this is where the problem arises. In many, not all, but in many Arab communities, the local councils have been taken over by the Hamulot, by mafia families, no less than that, who control the community funds that would go into schools and infrastructure and so on. It happens in a lot of these Jewish towns as well, by the way, where half the mayors of some of the towns are all up on corruption charges. You know, given the nephew building rights and land rights, and but don't want to go into that. So the government now is facing this issue, and I don't want to go in this other mindless dukiyum I mentioned before, where people were busting and that's a story we went into before. But what happened as a result of all this was that worldwide, when this protest took place, whatever protest might be, London was a good example of this, by the way, where in a protest about the climate, there were scores of Free Palestine flags. The Free Palestine movement has managed to wrangle itself into almost every protest movement that exists, including, and no less important, especially in this country, by the way, is the Black Lives Matter movement. So Free Palestine now has become a worldwide issue. And I remember, you can hear from my accent, when I was in South Africa way, way back, before mostly people I can see, a lot of young people were born. The ANC flag was used in protests all over London back in the 60s and 70s, right? Because it was, a symbol of oppression. Free Palestine has become a worldwide issue, whether we like it or not, and we have to deal with it. And one of the other projects I'm involved in is dealing with this, with students going to universities and facing this vitriolic anti-Israel apartheid type of vitriol because of this Free Palestine movement. And we're having huge problems trying to deal with this. But that, again, for another day. So the government is faced with this on the southern border. At the same time that this is all happening, on the northern border, you've got another terrorist organization, Hezbollah. Not only is Hezbollah an important organization as a terrorist organization, but this is a proxy Iranian war machine, no less than that. There are thousands of missiles in Hezbollah's armament that have very, very sophisticated navigation tools. And Israel's concerned about it. Perfect storm arrives, and what happened? Lebanon collapses as a country, literally collapses. And there's a very big chance, nobody really knows how it's going to go, that Lebanon can turn into another non-viable state, like Yemen or Iraq, or where Syria was going. So the northern border now becomes a focus that the government cannot put aside and say, okay, no, we'll deal with it in a couple of years' time. Well, let's deal with the other things first. This is on high priority, and becomes even more high priority because Assad, the president of Syria, a lot of people don't know this, is about to finally take over in southern Syria in a place called, I'm trying to think of the name, Dara, that's right. Dara is the name of the last stronghold that's being held out in southern Syria, which is very close to the Golan Heights. And once he takes over, this was a last stronghold of anti-Assad rebels, by the way, right? That had this sort of stronghold. They held out there for months, quietly, unbeknown to most of the world. The Russians were part of this, by the way. The Russians always have got a hand in what's happening in Syria. The Iranians now have almost got a link between a straight road from Tehran to Lebanon, to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And that's why Israel, by the way, is at war with Iran beneath the surface. There's a sea war that's been going on for months. Israel bombs Syria every night. There are warehouses and trucks. We don't know what's going on beneath the surface. That's the point I'm trying to make here. But as I said before, and I ended last week, I'm not ready to end yet, but my statement, and I'll say it again over and over again, that every Israeli government is faced with. Every day, Israelis wake up to an existential threat that no other country in the world wakes up to. And it's not a myth, by the way. So the northern border is very, 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 very important, has become a priority that Israel can't deal with. And I've got one last thing to do before we open up for questions. Afghanistan. Suddenly, out the blue, the Taliban are back in power, and that whether the Taliban puts on a great PR effort and makes out that they're different to the last Taliban, it's bullshit, to put it crudely. Right? It's nonsense. The Taliban are the Taliban are the Taliban. And Israel is going to have to deal with the Taliban. Now, the good thing about all this, and now we come to the positive side of what this government is having to deal with. Afghanistan is on the eastern border of Iran. And the Iranians don't like the Taliban as much as the Taliban don't like the Iranians. So suddenly, Iran has to worry about what's happening on its eastern border, which it never had to worry about before, because the Americans were there, and then before them the Russians were there, and before them the Brits were there, and before them the Chinese. Everybody's been in Afghanistan and got turfed out. So on the positive side, now this government is doing phenomenal things. Let me just go a quick forward thing onto this, because this is the big question. And I said it before, and I've said it again, and I'll say it over and over again. As long as Israel can depend on America for its tools, and it's a dangerous question, because Israel can't afford to antagonize American Jewry. That's another issue that has to be dealt with. But the great thing about what's happened, and I'm ending in a really good time here, because I wanted to have 15, 20 minutes for comments and questions people asked for in the past, is that the country is functioning. The different ministries are focused on their ministries. Why? Because they brought in this law we spoke about last time, the Norwegian law, Hokka Norvegi, where every minister has someone who takes their place in the Knesset, and they can function on going and doing their ministerial work. Cost the earth, by the way, but that's another story. Well, there's always another story here. You'll see where I'm going with another story. But the important point is that the country is now focused on what it needs to do function-wise. The issues are huge, but the issues of Israel in Israel have always been huge, right? That's another thing that people have, we tend to have a very short-term historical memory. We forget very quickly how things develop. But one thing Israelis are very, very good at is problem solving. That's why you have such a high-tech, successful industry. Because where we will, in the UK, be great at winning at the end, we always start off badly, whether it's the Second World War, wherever we go, we start off as Brits very badly. But in the end, we win. Same as COVID is a great example of this, right? We had the largest number of deaths in the world at one stage. Now we're about 17th on the list. Why? Not because everyone's caught up, but because we've changed and adapted and we've done things the right way. And again, then we open up and we will be guinea pigs, not for Pfizer, but we'll be guinea pigs for COVID. Doesn't matter. But Israelis are very, very successful at problem solving. And that's what this government, and that's why I wanted to bring this together and see it as why I'm positive in that sense. Right? It's very easy to be positive from London. It doesn't matter. That's another story. It doesn't matter. But the fact that problem solving has always been Israel's major asset is the focus of where all the issues that I've brought up that are facing this government are going to be dealt with. So what we've looked at over the last 2 weeks, we looked at the 23rd of March election, right? The 24th Knesset, the 36th government, the 36th government, how it was put together, the first crises, and tonight we've looked at COVID, the northern border, the southern border, and Afghanistan. Okay, so that's enough from me, I think, to set the tone and the atmosphere. Hopefully people have got comments and questions. And Steve, it's back to you. Let me just end my share screen. There we go. Right.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ian. Again, thank you for an in-depth and insightful summary of the government to date. Before I go on, we've got a couple of questions here. So on recurrent reports on the BBC World Service concerning the deteriorating situation in Lebanon, none of the experts seem to ever mention Hezbollah as a factor, or even their name. Can you offer any opinion on that? Can you explain that?
That's the BBC. You want more than that? Now, I'll tell you why. Because Hezbollah have very cleverly kept a very low profile. Remember, they were responsible for the blast that took this country down. They had been storing ammunition where they shouldn't have been. When it exploded, the whole country went. So Hezbollah very cleverly kept a very low profile. Remember, Hezbollah primarily situated in southern Lebanon, on Israel's northern border, Lebanon's southern border. And it's almost a state within a state, as it was when Fatah were there, when Arafat was around, for the people who remember those days, right? How long they'll keep a low profile depends on what happens in Lebanon. But, you know, the BBC, quite honestly, I prefer watching Al Jazeera between you and I, but that's besides the point. So my answer to that is I really wouldn't have an opinion on what the BBC say and do.
Okay, fair enough. There's another question here. Mansour Abbas of Ra'am Party has threatened to bring the current coalition down if Israel goes into a defensive war with either Hamas or Hezbollah. If with that in mind, what happens then?
The government collapses. But he's got much more to lose. Remember, Mansour Abbas has, for the first time, placed the Arab communities at the front on the desk of an Israeli cabinet, and they have to deal with it. Otherwise, literally, the government will fall. And don't forget for 1 minute that the opposition, particularly the Likud, who voted against the law about the unification of families. Remember, I spoke about it last week,
yeah,
of the families being united, where every year this law was automatically passed. For the first time, the opposition voted against it. And Netanyahu said openly, we are determined to bring this government down. Doesn't matter, at any cost. He took on board the slogan. So Mansour Abbas, I think, and remember, he's also got a public to play to, right? And with this jailbreak, has caused no end of problems as far as image is concerned. You know, are the Palestinian Arabs or the 1948 Arabs or the Israeli Arabs, however you want to call them, prepared to be seen as traitors by those outside of the 70th or the Green Line, however you want to call it again, who aren't Israeli citizens? There's a problem here. This is also the first time an Islamist party has supported a Zionist government, because that's what it is. This is the homeland of the Jews. And that's why, for as long as Bennett can keep ideology off the table, and my personal view is it's not going to be for long. Because once the budget goes through and everyone's working, and then people start questioning, well, what are you going to do about the statement you made about annexing parts of the West Bank? What are you going to do about the money that's supposed to be going that isn't? Those are the kind of questions that are going to come up. You know, Labour and Meretz are not going to sit quietly while more settlements are built or settlements are expanded. Neither is Mansour Abbas going to sit quiet. He can't. So just to finish, so it's a very, very difficult question for both sides. And at the moment, personally, I think he's got more to lose.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Just talking about, you know, the bringing the government down. If Israel what happens if the government collapses during a war, in a war situation? What happens?
There'd be an emergency government. First of all, there's an interim government before the country goes to elections, as what happened last time. Remember, there was this conspiracy theory, right?
Yeah.
That Netanyahu had, so there would be a war in Gaza, so that Bennett and Lapid wouldn't announce their unity government, which was due to be announced the day the rockets started flying. I don't believe in that conspiracy theory, by the way. I'm an historian. I believe in facts. Conspiracy theories you can keep to people who believe the Americans didn't land on the moon. I've heard that one being restated recently. So there's an interim government, and there'll probably be a national unity government, or they'll bring in people. They probably won't bring in a national unity because they've got enough. They've got guns. Is the defense minister who's been the defense minister. But Israel is preparing to go into Gaza with feet and boots on the ground. Don't underestimate this. And we're not far away from where it goes. People in Sderot was rocketed yesterday. There are no children in Sderot that aren't suffering from some kind of traumatic, whether it's post-stress trauma, whether it's whatever it is. Not one child is not in some kind of tipul, some kind of trauma dealing. Country can't live like that. And it's not only Sderot, by the way. There are kibbutzim and moshavim, and all along that border with Gaza, that has to be dealt with. So both sides of the coin here. Now remember as well, not just, I think it was a week ago, the balloons starting fires in the wheat fields had begun again. So this haslama, this word haslama is a word worth learning off by heart. This deterioration, the word is so critical. Anything can set a spark off that has a momentum of its own. And that's the danger. So bringing the government down, and I think everyone is aware of what the implications are. Okay,
we've got another member of the audience here asking on the subject of the convicts, 6 convicts who escaped. As I understand, 4 of them have now been caught? Yeah. Okay. Why doesn't Israel implement its death penalty on the terrorists who get life? It's a legal punishment in Israel, so why don't the Israeli courts apply it?
The last person that was put to death in Israel as a criminal was Eichmann. He was the first and probably the last. I'm not a judge and I'm not part of the judicial system and I don't know. But there's pressure on to put that into practice, right? One of the things that Israel does, and I've got to be careful here because I'm going to use a word that a lot of people are not going to like. It's called assassination. Israel would prefer to kill terrorists and not put them in jail. Now, I'm prepared to be contradicted. I'm prepared to have that debate. But for too long and too many generations, a great story came out to our brother. This is a side story. 19 years ago, a soldier in Mishmar HaGvul, in the border guards, stopped a massive terrorist explosion and saved many lives by diving on a bomb and got really, really badly injured and was paralyzed. Today, his daughter stopped a terrorist attack in Jerusalem. Huge. A generation passes to a generation, passes to a generation. That's the tragedy on both sides, as far as I'm concerned. And until that trust is put into practice, wherever it is, it's going to take a while. But I don't think that putting the death penalty into practice would be a smart move. I really don't.
A couple of people you may see in the chat, a couple of people have offered the opinion that if the terrorists were put to death, if the death penalty were applied, then they would be seen as martyrs and heroes, and the situation would well become worse.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately.
Absolutely. Whereas when there's an attack like there was in Jerusalem, there've been a lot of attacks, by the way, as a result of the jailbreak, stabbing attacks, right? People who've gone. In all three attacks, yesterday and today, the terrorist was shot and killed. And that's not by accident. So, and I think it's important. I think people need to understand that. And Israel knows how to deal with it, right? Israel's got a very good record, as sad as some of these terrorist attacks are, right? And some of them, the number that are stopped before we even know about it, before even Israelis know about it, is vast. You know, the Shabak and the Mossad and the underground security forces, for want of a better word, have got control of what's happening. It's not by chance, by the way, that an Israeli high-tech company with software called Pegasus has been spying on every major world leader, including Macron and Merkel and God knows nowhere else, is actually being used to control what goes on in the West Bank and other areas. Israel knows how to deal with this. Doesn't need the death penalty, in my view. And I think that person, whoever possibly is dead right. The last thing you need is martyrs.
Okay. All right, Ian. Touching on the this wave of intersectionality. You mentioned how even amongst the climate, the climate protests here, that you see the Palestinian flag and the Free Palestine. What do you believe would be a successful strategy to address the Free Palestine movement that's basically in putting itself into protests everywhere?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and a very interesting discussion as well, because my view has always been, my starting point with the interaction with the BDS movement or the Free Palestine movement starts with a very simple statement. Israel has an inalienable right, an unquestionable right to exist. If you don't accept that statement, then you and I have got nothing to talk about. What we have got to talk about is how Israel implements that right to exist. What does it mean? What does it mean to be democratic and a Jewish homeland? Are they compatible? Is it compatible to call the nation law, which recognizes Jews as being part of the Jewish homeland intrinsically and not anybody else? When an Israeli national football team plays at home in a Teddy Kollek stadium in Jerusalem, and the one Arab member of the team scores the most incredible goal, and one section of the crowd, the Beit Yerushalayim familiar mob, who are racist and fascist through and through, and no other word to describe it, boo the guy. Unheard of. So, that kind of discussion with the BDS movement starts with, do you accept that Israel has a right to exist? Yes. Okay. Now let's talk about how it exists. And then the discussion starts. Now, when you talk about Free Palestine, you've then got the issue of many Israelis from Meretz onwards who believe that there should be a Palestinian state. It's not only an Arab, Palestinian, Islamic, terrorist, extreme view. They're a minority. If you look at the structure of the Knesset, right? 62% of the Knesset voted for religious, hawkish parties. And you only have to look at that. I don't want to go back and open them, but you look at the numbers there, you'll see. So the minority, but it's a vocal minority who believe that there should be a Palestinian state. So that's where the discussion is. Not Free Palestine. Talk about how we can create a Palestinian state, if you will. What are the implications? Because the moment you know where my views are. I don't have to put them into public view here, but you can hear from where I come from, right? My belief is that 1948, Israel's war of survival has not ended. Israel faces this existential threat and has to deal with it. And until you guys are prepared to recognize that I have a right unequivocally to exist, and you will safeguard my existence wherever it might be smaller, maybe, we have to talk about that. But until I can trust that you will safeguard my future and my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, whatever it might be, I will not move from where I am. And that's the tragedy, unfortunately, the trust that needs to be built up. And over time, it will be built up. And you can see coming out of the Abraham Accords, for example, not that it's trust, but it's a start, there's no doubt. And that isn't new, by the way. Economic relations with the Emirates and the other, and Abu Dhabi and these places is not new. It's been going on for years. Even way back, Jaffa oranges were being eaten in Saudi Arabia in 1955 under some other name. So that's my answer to how you would deal with it. It's not something that gets dealt with overnight. And it's not something, by the way, that you go and you wave Israeli flags opposite them and scream the same vitriol back at them. That I don't believe gains anything. But that's, and I'm in the minority there, by the way, because there's some very, very hard protests on our side that take place when this is happening. But it's not an easy situation. And we have to be extremely sensitive to ourselves. When I, in Finchley, see guys who've driven down from Bradford with Palestinian flags billowing from their cars, and they're threatening to kill my wife and rape my daughter, I have a problem. So in the short answer is that it's not something that is dealt with overnight. That's how I would answer that. And sorry, one last thing. What we're doing as well, part of the project I'm involved in, is giving these tools of knowledge to our young students going onto campus. That's how I think I started. You and I were talking about, I think, that one of the major problems that I have in this community is that our kids lack the knowledge to stand up to that debate. That when the Free Palestinian flags are waving, and the BDS movement, who are well scripted, by the way, and are very, very knowledgeable in the debate that takes place, our kids are coming out of the schools, and I'm prepared to again go on the record, without enough knowledge about Israel and anti-Semitism to deal with this vitriol on the campuses. They haven't. And that worries me. And that's my passion, if you like, to somehow get our youngsters understanding and knowledgeable to be able to not only debate, but to take on this vitriol and deal with it intelligently and knowledgeably, which at the moment they're not able to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we've got a question. We've got a question here. You've mentioned that your passion lies in educating and getting ready the youngsters in our communities to those youngsters who will go on to maybe even leaving their Jewish schools and then going on to sixth form colleges, and they're with a they're with a multicultural class, and something flares up in Israel and they'll get challenged, or the students who go to university, and then it's really full on for them on most campuses throughout the country. So someone's asked here, I don't know if you're at liberty to answer this, what is your initiative for young people?
Yeah, I'll tell you what we're doing. The first thing, we've got a project of short video clips that people could see, and I'll give you my details afterwards where you can hook up.
If I could just stop you there, Ian, I'll happily share those with the follow-up email that I'll send out tomorrow to everyone. Yeah.
Great, if you would. So with that, we're also trying to deal with the Union of Jewish Students, for example. My unfortunate disillusionment with the schools is high. I was once a parent governor at JFS. And unfortunately, I've seen from close up, and I'm prepared to go on record here, right, of how the Jewish day schools are failing in preparing the kids for Israel and Zionism. That's the issue. My daughter came out of JFS, excuse me, being able to say every prayer backwards, frontwards, upside down, davening the whole thing. Ask her when the 6-day war took place, or ask her who David Ben-Gurion was, you wouldn't have a clue. I mean, she would, because she's my daughter. But that's how kids are coming out of the day schools, and that's unacceptable to me. So we are, through the Union of Jewish Students, setting up these kind of interactive sessions on anti-Semitism and Israel. Because one of my accusations of Israelis, and I don't know if there are any Israelis on the thing here, is that Israelis do not care what happens in the diaspora as far as their actions are concerned. And I'll tell you why. There was a great musical in the 1960s that people with gray hair and more might remember it, I Like Mike. In the musical of I Like Mike, it was an Israeli musical, there's a song there called Kol Ha'olam Negdeinu. The whole world is against us. So it doesn't matter what we do. And they sing it, it doesn't matter what we do, the whole world hates us anyway, and it's anti-Semitism. And that attitude, that's from the 60s, by the way, has gone right the way through to now. Doesn't matter what we do, they hate us anyway, so we don't care. What really is the issue is that the diaspora, in its connection to Israel and its Zionism, is directly impacted what Israel does. And it didn't start with a war in Gaza, by the way. The surge after the Gaza war isn't something new. These guys driving down from Bradford with their flags wasn't something new. It just happened to be more intense and more vitriolic. 10 years ago, they didn't threaten to kill my wife and rape my daughter. They just came down with flags. So the issue really of getting to the students is, I think, fundamental. And for Israelis to understand that interaction with the Jewish communities is critical. You cannot turn young American Jews off Israel, which up to a point was what was happening. A large proportion of American Jews, in fact, the overwhelming proportion of American Jews are conservative and reform. Now, whether Israel likes it or not, it has to deal with the multifunction of Jewish religiosity, if you want a better word. Turn those young Jews away from Israel, and we have a problem. Because this is your future leadership of the American Jewish community. The last thing Israel can afford to do is to have the evangelical movement of the South, the non-Jewish evangelical movement, who love Israel and give loads of money to Israel and bring everyone to get baptized in the Jordan River that isn't a river but a stream, except for where it's near the kibbutzim. Right? If anyone's been to the Jordan River up where I used to live, well, to call it a river is anyway, it doesn't matter. But Israel cannot afford to prioritize the evangelical movement over the young American Jewish community. That's my personal belief. And that's what we're trying to do here as well, is to get the students knowledgeable through this kind of medium, discussion, questioning, hearing from people like me, even though I've got a gray beard, whatever it is, there is knowledge that can be passed over and dealt with. It's knowledge, it's fact, it's history. That's what we're talking about. And they need this. And we absolutely need to educate them. And we cannot afford to say, well, we've tried, didn't work. The Holocaust, and I'll end on this, right? Holocaust studies in the UK have been phenomenal. Everybody is Holocaust aware, and everybody can quote you the stories, and the story of every single Holocaust survivor is critical and vital. It is not enough. The Holocaust story is waning in the sense of its importance. I'm not trying to undermine it here. Importance is the wrong word. Relevance is also the wrong word. but it's a critical issue. It's history to a lot of young people, long history. Like for me, the Vietnam War was yesterday. For my kids, they look at me like I'm crazy. The Vietnam War, we don't even know where Vietnam is, never mind that there was a war there. The Holocaust took place a long time ago. And soon we're not going to have survivors around to tell their private story, their personal story. So somehow getting the Holocaust into our Zionist education, I believe, is not enough. We need Israel into the story as well. And for too long, Israeli history and the Israel story has been neglected. And for all kinds of reasons. And I don't want to point fingers, but there are a lot of fingers to be pointed at, and a lot of individuals that it doesn't matter. I'm not going down that road. So that's the kind of project we're trying to build on. And there's a lot of enthusiasm. I am quite surprised, by the way, by the enthusiasm and the positiveness, for want of a better word, that the student organizations have taken on board. I expected there to be much more apathy and much more, leave us alone. We just want to keep our heads down, wear a baseball cap instead of a kippah, and I'll take my Magen David and put it under my t-shirt and not over my t-shirt. We're not having that. There's much more. We need to know, we want to know how we're going to do it. And that's very encouraging.
I think kudos to the UJS. They're stepping up. They're doing great work. Ian, thank you for this evening. I'm going to just put it out there. If anyone has any other questions for Ian, please either submit them right now or write in if you think of anything, and I can always put it to Ian at a later date. Just
before you shut us all down, I'm going to have a plug. I'm going to make just a quick
plug. I was going to ask you to
do the plug.
Plug it.
Let me do the plug, and then you can add to the plug.
Yeah, absolutely fine.
I run a 6-week block of episodes of sessions called Israel Updates. It's a weekly update of what's happened in Israel the last week. It could be an hourly update, quite honestly. The next block starts tomorrow evening, and Steve will tell you where and how you can communicate with us. But if you're interested, please, feel free. There's a small charge, by the way. We charge £10. The reason for that is if you give anything away free, people don't value it. That's my belief. And also it makes people come. Otherwise, people just sign up and then they say, I'm not coming, I didn't pay, so I don't know. Then you pay £10, you come, so it's worth it.
I'll put in, just for everyone here, I will make sure that I put in all of the details in the email tomorrow morning, which will then give you time to, if you decide to sign up, then you can sign up for tomorrow evening. So thank you very much once again, Ian. You've been great. You've explained everything in a very clear, concise, simplistic way for the simpletons like myself. So thank you. It's been very interesting. Thank you everyone again for joining us. Again, Shana Tova. For those who observe Yom Kippur, Chatima Tova. Have an easy fast. Wish you well over the fast. Stay safe. And just for all of those here this evening, we have another webinar coming up, a virtual adventure in Modi'in, the city of the Maccabees. So we have that. Again, I'll put in all the details in the email for tomorrow morning, and we look forward to seeing you in the very near future. We've got some very interesting and exciting events coming up, which we'll be advising through our newsletter and through our social media in the coming days and weeks. So Chatima Tova, thank you. Have a good evening. Thanks, Ian. Take care.
Thank you. Shana Tova, and be well, be safe.
Take care. Bye-bye.